It had been a long day at work, and as I stepped into my house, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The house was empty, as it usually was when I worked late. My family was out, and for the first time in weeks, I had the place to myself. I was 16, a big fan of gaming, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet evening spent in front of my computer. The dark house was cozy in its silence, with the faint hum of the fridge in the background. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door, flicked the switch on the hallway light, and made my way to my bedroom. I logged into StarCraft almost instinctively, diving into the familiar glow of the screen. I had only been playing for about an hour when the doorbell rang. Twice. My fingers froze on the mouse as I glanced at the clock on my computer. It was already after 9 p.m. I felt a brief flicker of annoyance. Who could be visiting this late? I got up and walked downstairs to the front door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a figure standing on the porch. A shadowy silhouette. A bit wary, but trying to dismiss any unease, I opened the door slightly, keeping the storm door shut between us. "Hello?" I asked, keeping my voice polite but neutral. A frail voice answered, barely audible. "Could I use your phone?" I was about to turn her down when I got a closer look at the woman standing before me. She looked to be in her late 60s or early 70s. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes were wrinkled, and she carried an odd, too-wide smile. She looked harmless enough, though the way she was standing there felt off. I hesitated. "I'm sorry, but the library's just down the street. They'll have a phone you can use," I said, offering a polite smile. Her grin didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "That's rude," she said softly, a hint of reproach in her tone. "I just need to make a call." I frowned. It wasn't that I didn't want to help, but I had been taught never to invite strangers inside. "I can't let you in," I said, starting to edge the door closed. "It's just a rule in my house." The woman didn't move, still smiling, but there was something about her demeanor that felt different now. Like she was too calm, too patient. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. But still, I closed the door. I returned to my game, trying to push the weird interaction out of my mind. But then the doorbell rang again. I froze. There was no way I was answering it this time. I had learned long ago not to let my guard down, especially when I was alone. I didn't know what her intentions were, but I wasn't about to find out. I resumed my game, focusing hard on the screen. But then something made me pause. A soft tapping. It came from the window. The blind was pulled down, but I could hear the unmistakable sound of something metallic hitting the glass. The tap-tap-tapping seemed deliberate, rhythmic. I swallowed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Could it be her? The woman from the door? I turned off the sound on my computer, trying to listen for anything that might give me a clue. The tapping persisted, slow and steady. I stood up from my chair, my heart pounding, and slowly approached the window. There was no way I was opening it, but I had to know what was going on. Through the thin gap in the blinds, I could just make out a shadow moving just outside. I held my breath. Whoever it was didn't seem to be leaving. The tapping stopped for a moment, and my heart skipped a beat when I heard the faintest whisper through the glass. It was too muffled to make out the words, but the tone. It wasn't the soft, frail voice I had heard earlier. I quickly backed away from the window and retreated to the living room, hoping that whatever it was would go away. I sat in the dark, trying to distract myself with TV, but the silence was overwhelming. Then, the doorbell rang again. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just a harmless old lady who didn't know where she was going. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. When I finally mustered the courage to stand up, I crept to the door, slowly and quietly, hoping to peek through the peephole without being seen. I didn't expect what I saw. Standing on the porch was not the same woman. This time, it was a man. His face was gaunt, and he looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. He was dressed in dark, nondescript clothing and stood a little too still, almost like a mannequin. He stared at the door, his eyes wide, scanning for any sign of movement. The way his gaze lingered unnervingly on the window. I felt an overwhelming urge to lock every door, every window. "Have you seen my mother?" he asked, his voice too calm. He barely even blinked. "She was here earlier." I was speechless for a moment. I didn't know what to say. The woman had mentioned nothing about a son. I forced myself to respond, telling him she had asked to use the phone and then left. His expression faltered and he nodded, almost too quickly. "I'm sorry. She has dementia," he said, his tone flat. "She probably got confused. I just want to make sure she's okay." There was something strange about the way he spoke. He didn't sound concerned enough for someone looking for their mother. It was like he had rehearsed it. I told him she might have gone around to the backyard, gesturing toward the rear of the house. I felt the hair on my neck stand up as he thanked me, then turned and walked down the path to the backyard. I closed the door slowly, watching him through the window. I waited, but when I peeked outside, he was gone. There was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. The backyard was empty. I felt something in my stomach tighten. This was all wrong. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe the man had gone to check on his mother. But as the night wore on, my unease grew. By midnight, I could still hear the faint tapping sound coming from the window. And then, just when I thought I was imagining things, the doorbell rang again. This time I didn't even hesitate. I ran upstairs to my bedroom, locked the door, and stayed there barely breathing. I knew something was wrong. There were too many pieces that didn't fit. The woman, the man, the tapping, all of it. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my father. When I explained what had happened, he was immediately concerned. He said I did the right thing by not opening the door. We both agreed that everything about it felt off, too well coordinated. How had the man known exactly where his mother had gone? Why hadn't he checked the backyard, even though I had told him where she was? It felt like a well-planned attempt to gain access to the house. It wasn't until that night, a week later, that I realized how much danger I had narrowly avoided. My friend Cody had asked me to watch his dog, Theo, for the night. When Theo started barking relentlessly at something outside, I initially dismissed it. But when Theo ran to the back door and kept barking, I figured he might want to go outside. As I neared the door, I froze. Someone was trying to open the door from the outside. Through the screen, I could see a man's face staring back at me. Someone I didn't recognize. His eyes were wild and his expression was distorted, like he was struggling to keep his composure. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound firm. "I'm looking for Melissa," he muttered, his voice shaking. I told him there was no Melissa here and demanded he leave. After a few more strained seconds, he turned and walked off into the night. I didn't realize until much later how eerily similar the situation was to the one I had experienced a week ago. Was this the same man? Had he been scouting places like he had before? I didn't know. But the feeling I got from that encounter was one I wouldn't soon forget. Sometimes, there's no such thing as a coincidence. And I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again.
Today, I want to share the story of my first time living alone, a time that should have been exciting, but turned into something that still gives me chills. What happened in that small apartment changed the way I see the world, and even now, I can't shake the fear it left behind. I was 19 and living alone for the first time in a small studio apartment just off campus. It wasn't glamorous by any means, peeling paint on the walls, a heater that groaned like an old man in the winter, and creaky wooden floors that seemed to echo louder at night. But it was cheap, and it came with just enough freedom to feel exciting. My parents had pushed for me to find a better place in a safer neighborhood, but I was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could manage. The building had its quirks. The faint, stale smell that lingered in the halls was the first thing you noticed when you stepped in. The stairwell light on my floor flickered more often than not, casting long, uneven shadows on the walls, and the tenants mostly kept to themselves. I'd see the occasional neighbor passing by, a polite nod here, a mumbled hello there, but for the most part, the place was eerily quiet. Sometimes I wondered if I was the only one living there. One night, after a long study group that ran later than usual, I got home around 10 p.m. The stairwell light was in one of its flickering fits again, stuttering like a weak pulse. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, adjusting the strap of my bag, when I heard faint footsteps above me. They were soft, measured, almost deliberate. I brushed it off. People live here, I reminded myself. Of course, there would be footsteps, but when I reached my floor and glanced down the hallway, it was empty. The motion-activated lights were off, and the silence was thick, like something pressing against my ears. I locked the door behind me and tried to settle in for the night. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and told myself to stop being ridiculous. But as I stood in the bathroom, towel in hand, I heard it. A faint tapping. My entire body froze. It was coming from the living room window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge outside that window. Slowly, I turned off the bathroom light and crept to the window, heart hammering in my chest. Pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out, I saw nothing. Just the dark, empty street below. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably the wind. Maybe a bird. I didn't want to admit how unsettled I was, but the unease stayed with me like a shadow I couldn't shake. 2 nights later, the peace shattered. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to a loud thud. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear where it had come from. A moment of silence. Then, another thud, louder this time, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I got out of bed, tiptoeing to the door, and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the motion-activated lights hadn't turned on. That struck me as odd. They always flicked on when someone walked by. Then I noticed it, a crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor just in front of my door. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked it, cracked it open just enough to snatch the paper, and slammed it shut again. The note was simple. A single word scrawled in jagged, almost childlike handwriting. Hello. I barely slept that night. Every sound, the groan of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, made my skin crawl. The next day, I reported the incident to my landlord. He shrugged it off with a lazy wave of his hand, muttering something about college pranks. But that didn't explain the lack of footsteps in the hallway or why the lights hadn't activated. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. The noises stopped, and I started to feel at ease again. Maybe it really had been a prank, but just when I was beginning to relax, something else happened. It was a Friday night, and I was curled up on the couch with my laptop. My phone buzzed with a notification, an airdrop request from an unknown device. My stomach dropped as I read the message. Why don't you look outside? I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes darted to the window. The curtain was drawn, but I could feel the weight of something or someone on the other side. Against my better judgment, I turned off the lights and crept to the window. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. There he was, standing on the sidewalk 3 stories below. A man, tall and thin, with his face tilted up toward me. Even from that distance, I could tell he wasn't blinking. He stood completely still, his silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. Barely able to get the words out between panicked breaths. The dispatcher assured me someone would be there soon, but those minutes stretched into an eternity. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. I told them everything, but their reassurances felt hollow. My apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. The next day, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the man wouldn't come back. But when I returned to my apartment a few days later, I saw it. Written on the outside of my window in greasy, smeared letters were 2 words, "See you." I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. Within a week, I terminated my lease and moved out. Even now, months later, I still look over my shoulder. The sound of tapping on a window makes my stomach twist. And at night, when the world is quiet, I wonder if he's still out there, looking for me.
Today I want to share something that still haunts me. It happened when I was 16, alone on my family's farm. What started as a quiet night turned into something I'll never forget and never quite escape. I know every inch of this farm. I've walked these fields since I was a kid, and every fence post, every rusted piece of machinery feels like an extension of my own memory. But that night, something felt different. My parents were away at a livestock auction, leaving me to manage the property alone. At 16, I was used to responsibility. We'd been on this land for generations, and I knew how to handle things. Or so I thought. It was just past 8 p.m. when I first noticed something was wrong. The automatic gate at the end of the long driveway, the one I always made sure was locked, was standing wide open, not just unlocked. Wide. Open. I grabbed the flashlight from the mudroom and stepped onto the porch. The Nebraska winter wind cut through my flannel, carrying nothing but silence and the distant rustle of dried cornfields. No cars, no movement, just that open gate. I knew every sound this property made, the creaking of the windmill, the gentle sway of the barn's loose tin roof, the gate's distinctive metallic groan when the wind caught it owned. But this silence was different, pregnant, waiting. My first mistake was walking down to close the gate myself instead of calling my dad. The gravel crunched under my boots, each step feeling louder than it should. The gate's chain hung loose, the padlock nowhere in sight. When I reached to pull the gate closed, I saw the first footprint. Not mine, not from any of our farm vehicles. Fresh, distinct, human. That's when I heard the barn door slide open behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. Something inside me, some survival instinct, kept me absolutely still. The barn was about 50 yards back, silhouetted against the moonlight, and something was moving inside it. My dad's hunting rifle was in the truck. My phone was back in the house. And whoever was in that barn knew exactly where I was standing. The footsteps that emerged weren't rushed. They were deliberate, calculating. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. We were too far from town, and the winter storms always messed with our cell reception. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear the crunch of gravel, the methodical approach. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was my land, my territory. I took a step back, then another, trying to create distance without making noise. The barn continued to loom behind whatever was approaching. I remembered the old root cellar near the barn. If I could make it there, I might have a chance to hide. "I know you're here," a voice called out. Deep, male, calm. No need to run. I froze. The voice wasn't angry. It was almost conversational, like someone asking for directions. But there was an underlying tone, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I dialed 911 on my phone, knowing there was no way the call would go through, but I needed to do something. Anything. The footsteps stopped. Just stopped. Right where the gravel met the grass leading to the barn. "You're not supposed to be here alone," the voice said again. Closer now. Much closer. I backed up another step. My foot caught on a loose rock and I stumbled. The sound seemed to echo across the empty fields. The moment I lost my balance was the moment I knew I'd made a mistake. A shadow moved between me and the farmhouse, between me and safety. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I was no longer in control of anything. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but my mind scrambled for a plan. There was only one way left to move, toward the house. I bolted, running blindly, the cold air burning my lungs. The footsteps behind me grew faster, too close. I didn't dare look back. I threw open the door, slamming it behind me, pressing my back to the wall. The house was silent again, too silent. My heart raced. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an eternity. By the time I dared look outside, the night was still. The gate was open, the barn empty. I never saw him again, but the weight of that night stayed with me. And I still wonder if I really got away.